Jackson, Mississippi is an over 80% African American city, and they are now without water. Not just without drinking water, without water. They can't flush toilets, they can't bathe, they can't wash hands. They are without water. And when some water does come through the pipes, we'll give you a sense of what that looks like. This was a little video, just 12 or 13-second video from Molly Minta, who lives just north of Jackson, Mississippi. She put this video up on her Twitter account, and it's up to over 12 million views right now. So this went viral. Here's the water in Jackson, Mississippi. Just extraordinary. Jackson, Mississippi has had problems with water for years and years. You know, this week I was looking into this because I knew we were going to cover this, and I just wanted to look into it anyway. And so, you know, I started reading articles and doing some research about it. And so I just searched in my podcast feed, Jackson Water. I figured I'd listen to some, you know, radio shows about it, some podcasts about it. And I'm listening to one radio show where they talk about how there was an ice storm on Valentine's Day and the water treatment plant was not able to function as a result of the freeze, and that they've been without water, without usable water, like little to no water coming out of the faucets since Valentine's Day. And I'm thinking, has Jackson been without water for 7 months? That can't possibly be right. And then I checked the date on that podcast, and it was March of 2021, right? So, like, they had a similar problem last year. And they're obviously still having this problem now.
Well, that happens here a lot, too.
Because of, obviously, rain, flooding, a wet season, right? And so, you know, it's just amazing that this is happening one more time. I did want to make a point, but go ahead. You wanted to cut in there? Go ahead.
No, that happens here too. When I was here, they were just coming out, in 2019, they were just coming out of a boil.
You mean
water.
Here in New Orleans?
In New Orleans. They were just coming out of a boil water advisory, which, coming from New York City, I'm like, you got a what now? you got a boil water advisory. For
people who don't know what Russell's
water?
talking about there, New York City is famous for its clean tap water. You could always drink the water out of the faucets in New York. It's got some of the best tap water in the world.
Wins taste tests against like bottled water.
That's why the pizza's good. That's why the bagels are good. They say it's all about the water.
Well, that's why New Yorkers will never like that outside of New York. Yeah, there is definitely, and this, as you're saying, it's true in the South in general. It's particularly true in certain places. New Orleans is infamous for its just horrible infrastructure. Like really, the roads in Costa Rica are better than the roads in New Orleans.
Well, look,
going through the streets and neighborhoods, it's just like crumbling asphalt, just crumbling, just potholes and just falling apart. Like they haven't repaired these roads in decades.
Well, look, this is often framed as a racial issue, rightfully so, because if you look, it's majority black cities in southern states that have this crumbling infrastructure. A majority black city is also a deep blue city in the middle of a deep red state. And this is where this becomes a major political problem. If you're a majority Democrat city in a deep red state, it means that your people have no representation, and there is no incentive at the state level to help you fix the fucking roads or to help you fix the fucking water pipes, right? There's just no incentive because you're not going to vote for the Republican governor anyway. He knows that. He figures you're last on my list, right? You are the lowest priority. You really are completely disenfranchised in that way. You have no political power because you have no representation. You have no effect on state politics whatsoever. I grew up just outside a very poor majority minority city in New York State. Now, they have Democratic leadership at the city level in Newburgh, and most of the time, New York has Democratic leadership at the state level. And what this creates is subservience to Democratic leadership from a poor city like Newburgh. This is not just how Republicans fuck people over, it's how centrist corporate Democrats fuck people over. Because the city, a poor city like Newburgh, has to stay in good standing with Andrew Cuomo because they need him to give them state funding, and also they need him to go to bat to get federal funding for Newburgh's roads, for the schools, right, for this and that. And so this problem exists amongst poor black cities in blue states, but at least they feel like they are at least theoretically represented at the state level. A poor black city in a state like Mississippi is completely disenfranchised, or a poor black city in a state like South Carolina pulls no weight at the state level, which is why scumbags like James Clyburn are able to stay in power for so long, because he represents power. He represents clout. Right. He represents might. So even if he doesn't do fuck all for you, he can say, hey, listen, I'm whatever he is. What is he, second ranking Democrat in the House to Nancy Pelosi? Second, third, something like that. Top five, I don't know. He's up there. He's like, listen, I can rep you. You have basically no power locally, because your local government is completely impotent because they're completely neglected by the state government. The state government doesn't give a fuck about you either way because they know they're not going to get your vote, and they know they can win without your vote. So they just are perfectly happy to treat you like you don't exist whatsoever. And so here I am. I represent power. I represent, representation, right? And even though that is very often a false representation, because it doesn't actually lead to improvement of the people's qualities of life there, as we prove. We had Marcel Dixon, who ran against him on the show, talking about how a guy like Clyburn just leaves his district in shambles. He at least represents the possibility of enfranchisement, right? And so that's how these like centrist Democrats keep their power too. And it's a huge problem, because these same voters will look at a candidate like Sanders and say, well, okay, even if we sympathize with what Sanders is saying, with Sanders' outlook, right, with how he wants to represent us, he's going to run into maybe the same problem that our local mayor runs into, whereas he's going to make enemies of everyone in the system, and they're going to railroad him, right? They're going to just ignore him at best, crush him at worst. And so he doesn't represent that institutional power, whereas a guy like Joe Biden does, because he has the endorsement of their local guy who represents power, right? It's all about representing that you can actually go to bat for people who have no one to represent them whatsoever. And this is why the only way to build that power is from the bottom up. What the Sanders campaigns represented was this kind of weird opportunity to try and build working class power from the top down, right? Using a presidential campaign to build a working class movement. But we saw the limitations of that. We saw the failings of that in places like South Carolina, where you had very poor African-American cities and towns just vote overwhelmingly for a Democratic machine that has nothing but total contempt for them. But they know that they have them by the balls, because they know that these people have nowhere else to go and no hope of any type of enfranchisement whatsoever at the state level, at the local level, anywhere.
Well, a good example of what you're talking about here in New Orleans, when the abortion ruling first came down, New Orleans tried to deal with it by saying they're just not going to enforce it. They're going to refuse to prosecute. They're going to refuse to investigate. That's going to be the policy. And the state legislature held back much needed funding for infrastructure that New Orleans was waiting on because of that, and made getting that funding conditional on backing off on that. So the local government is not even free to set policies within its own jurisdiction. That's how little power they have relative to the Republicans who are actually running a state. And unlike most of the red states, you actually have a Democratic governor here, but he's pro-life.
Right.
So that's not helping.
I mean, Louisiana is a perfect example where the Democrats are almost, I mean, you could even say as useless as the GOP.
Well, and this is something, this is a deeper subject. The Republicans very often, very effectively make a lot of hay of how many Democrat-run cities are hellholes of economic inequality and crime and inefficiency. And places like Los Angeles is a very good example. And, they're not wrong about that. But one thing that's really interesting about those cities is the fact that northern schools tend to be more segregated than schools in the South. You do have more income inequality in cities that are blue cities. And I think that's a consequence of neoliberalism. I think it's a natural outgrowth of neoliberalism, just as the inequality nationally that we're talking about, that I'm seeing how it's played out here in New Orleans and how it's affected the culture of New Orleans. That's a natural consequence of neoliberalism. It's a lot of waving of a lot of flags, and it's a lot of slogans of Black Lives Matter, but fundamentally, it's a redistribution of wealth to those who already have it. So in the end, you get a lot of virtue signaling about race, a little bit about class, but at the end of the day, there's a big NIMBY situation going on.
Please clap.